Welcome, Richard, to this virtual program that we've managed to organize this evening. Thank you for your spontaneity in accepting our invitation. I'm absolutely delighted. And Richard, before I do the official formal welcome, you have a host of your friends with you here today. Devangana Desai, Saryu Doshi, Shilpa Shah, Ashok Das. I mean, the list is Susan Bean. My God, it's 8:30 in the morning. That's fine, Susan, not crack of dawn. There are so many, Susan Sharma, many familiar people who would have been with us at the CSMVS to hear you speak today. So thank you everyone for joining. I'm really so pleased. Many members of our own committee are there. My vice chair, Anita, is there. Of course, Jason is there. Aarti Vakil is there. Gopal is there. Many of our members have joined. So thank you all so much. It means a lot to me in particular, but to all of us to connect in this way, which we have been doing for the past 23 months. So thank you, Richard. And on behalf of the chairman and the trustees of the CSMVS and the Director General, whom you know very well, Mr. Sabyasachi Mukherjee, and my own committee at the Museum Society, my members, and so many of our guests who have joined us here today to hear you on, when you mentioned to me, I'm going to speak, Feroza, on one iconic piece. I said, please do that. Yale Center for British Art used to give scholarships to people like Pauline Rohatty. And I remember her going to Yale and giving a lecture. She was on a 3-week sabbatical there in Connecticut, and she spoke on the lost collection of Francis Swain Ward. And from that collection, she picked up just one painting, oil painting. So I think it's a wonderful idea when we focus so much on one painting or one textile in this case and cover a gamut of objects around it. So thank you very much for this suggestion. And thank you very much for being with us here today. For those younger members of our society, a few words about our good friend, Mr. Richard Blurton. Pay attention. He trained as an archaeologist and worked at Kandahar in Afghanistan during the 1970s and at Vijayanagar in Karnataka in the early 1980s. He joined the British Museum in 1986, where he was on the staff for the next 32 years, retiring in 2018, having become head of the South and Southeast Asia section in the Department of Asia. During that time, he mounted many exhibitions, mostly in London, but an iconic exhibition in 97-98 at the NGMA Mumbai. It was co-hosted and curated, as he reminded me a little earlier, both by the BM, the British Museum, and the BL, the British Library. And the director of the NGMA was none other than Dr. Saryu Doshi, and I'm so glad that she's here with us this evening. It was called The Enduring Image. It was a wonderful exhibition. Some of you may remember that. Other exhibitions have been devoted to Hinduism, Bengal, modern cloth of gold textiles, Jodhpur paintings, Arunachal Pradesh, and most recently, and also the last before his retirement in 2018, Vaishnava devotion pieces in Assam, and the manifestation of this in the 17th century textile production. He's also been involved with a sequence of exchange and training programs between India and the UK. I'm just going to say it now because I'm dying to say it. I hope you can come and spend about 6 to 8 months here once the pandemic is over and the visa situation is slightly loosened up, and teach us about these things over here. It's better to have the professor here than to have 20 students go to London, although I'm sure they would enjoy doing that. So keep that in mind when you're planning your next trip to India. Acha? He's published extensively in both scholarly and popular formats, including Hindu art in 1992, Bengali myths in 2006, and Krishna in the Garden of Assam in 2016. His current book is a history of India through objects based in the British Museum collections due to be published in the spring of 2022, next year. Of course, he is retired, but he continues to write and he loves to travel to India and he loves Indian food. That much I can vouch for. So this evening we're about to hear in this talk, he'll elaborate about a spectacular sequence of textiles known as the Vrindavani Vastra. These were products of the intense Vaishnava Bhakti movement that grew up in the Assam Valley as a result of the life and teaching of the late saint Shankaradeva, who died in 1568. They are of woven silk and use the Lampas technique to produce narrative textiles of considerable complexity. For the narratives, the weavers drew on the stories in chapter 10 of the Bhagavata Purana, in which the youthful exploits of Krishna are detailed. In the British Museum, there's a remarkable example of a Vrindavani Vastra textile. Indeed, it is actually made up of 12 individual strips of separate textile, which together measure more than 9 meters in length. The story of their production, use, and their onward history outside Assam, in Tibet, and then in the UK will form the basis of Richard's talk. They reached London following the Younghusband Expedition of 1903-1904, after which objects from Tibet, including this particular Indian item, entered the collection of various museums beyond the confines of the Himalayas. So thank you very, very much, Richard. We are looking forward to the talk. And before I pass it over to the technical team, I would like to thank them. Normally we have 3 young tech team people, but they're not bunking college, nor are they bunking their exams. They're actually doing their exams. But Aishwarya, Mrinalini, and Sharanya, thank you so much for being with us every evening and helping us through this exercise. And we couldn't have done it without Professor Jason Johns, who leads the team, and along with Yashraj. So Jason and Yashraj, hand the mic over to Dr. Richard Blurton. Thank you so much. Thank you very, very much.
Good evening, everyone. Well, thank you, Firoza, for your wonderful and fulsome introduction. I would just like to say further to that, what an honor and pleasure it is for me to be able to speak to the Museum Society this evening. Your institution, the staff, the director there, all of these have been a great inspiration to me over the many years. So it's just a great honor for me to be speaking this evening. And also from a more personal point of view, given that I have always so greatly enjoyed visiting your city, I feel quite poignant about this event this evening, and I'm ever so much looking forward to being with you again in the flesh, as it were, and perhaps having a dish of jingar or similar to satisfy my desire for good Indian cuisine. I also must just mention, as Firoza did, the presence of Susan Bean on the list of attendees. Susan, grand to have contact with you, and I'm very impressed at your diligence in being here so early in the morning. Anyway, enough of all that. My talk this evening is, as Firoza mentioned, mostly about one textile of a type that has become known today as Vrindavani Vastra, that is the cloth, the Vastra of Vrindavan, near Mathura. And these textiles are originally from Assam. They come out of the Bhakti tradition focused on Krishna and associated especially with the name of Shankaradeva and his successors Madhavdeva and Mudramadeva. Shankaradeva, and forgive me to any Assamese speakers who are watching this evening, of course, if I was more if I was better tutored in Assamese, I would of course say Honpadeb, but my Assamese is very limited, so forgive me. I'm going to stick to the more usual pronunciation of the great saint's name as it is outside Assam. His name, he died in 1568. We don't quite know when he was born, but his name will come up repeatedly, as also maybe his successors, Madhavdev and Modradev. By far the largest of these Vrindavani Vastra textiles, though probably not the oldest, has recently been displayed at the British Museum, along with two other examples. As Firoza mentioned just now, the BM example is made up actually of 12 strips of individual cloth woven in the Lampas technique. We'll speak more about that in a moment, and figured with scenes either from the life of Krishna, as laid out in chapter 10 of the Bhagavata Purana, or avatars of Vishnu. And there is also one remarkable element within these textiles, and that is that text can be woven into the textiles along with imagery. So it's highly sophisticated weaving technique that is being used here. I need hardly include maps, I guess, but let's just very quickly look at Assam, dominated, of course, by the presence of the Brahmaputra there, flowing from the northeast to southwest. Here, a detail of the area, and especially just notice Barpeta here, west and on the northern bank from Guwahati. We believe that this may have been the center where the textile production was carried out, and also Majuli here, the great island in the center of the Brahmaputra, which remains still a center of great Vaishnava, Krishna-centered devotion, and in which the narratives that are shown in the textiles are still animated every year in music and dance. Now, here is the British Museum example of the Vrindavani Vastra. As you can see, it's made up of 12 individual strips of cloth, and starting, you can see here, starting from the right, 10 intact examples, and then the last two on the left-hand side with the great bite out of it. We don't know what this means in terms of the history of the textile, but that's how it has come down to us. You will also notice that at the top, there are 3 strips of added colored silk textile, and then one of brocade above. We'll again come back to that later. Oh dear. Excuse me. Yes. I mentioned that the textile was made using the Lumpus technique. This is a form of weaving which has, I believe, now completely died out in India, but it's highly sophisticated, but it enables 2 warps and 2 wefts to be woven at the same time. The effect of this is to have a background and a foreground. And in this close-up detail of part of the textile, you can see this very clearly. The background, the brown background, is densely woven with one set of warp and weft, and the detail of the figural design, this is actually the head of the serpent Kalia, this is almost as it were in relief, and this is woven with a separate set of warp and weft threads, and it's not done. It's done all at the same time. So such a technique enables great sophistication in the detailing of the design. This is the back side of one of those textiles. Some work has been done on Lampas in India. My colleague at the V&A, Rosemary Krill, whom many of you will know, now retired like myself, was one of the early investigators, both of this Lampas tradition in Assam, but also in other parts of India. But we still, I think, are some way off fully understanding how these elements were gathered together and how it was they came to be practiced in Assam. There is no obvious descendant of them today, and we don't know how the technique reached Assam, but it probably flourished there for about 200 years. And I should just mention here that in terms of chronology, there is little to go on, frankly. We can only look at the way in which designs develop or decay to get some clue of dating. The example in the BM, that great big textile of 12 different strips, over 9 meters in length, it's a huge item. I don't know that all of those different strips are indeed even of the same date. So there's lots of uncertainty and still lots of interest to discuss and to explore in the future. Now, here we have a close-up of 2 of those strips of 12 textile that make up the full item today, and we can quickly see that there's a color difference. You can see the fragment to the left side has a very dark background, then we have a lighter ground, and then a darker ground. And also you'll notice that the scenes don't run across. So the arrangement that we see today is I think, nothing to do with the original purpose of the cloths. Originally, they were woven about 80 centimeters in width and were single items. They weren't all united in the form that we see today. More of that later on. Here is a detail of that, one of those 2 strips. And here you can see quickly that the textile artists who produced this work were drawing on well-known Krishna narratives that eventually go back to the Bhagavata Purana. At the top here, you can perhaps make out a tree-like arrangement with a figure in it and figures below. This we presume is the Vastra story. Below that, a figure dancing on the great serpent Kalia. So this is the Kalia Daman story. Below that, there's this pinwheel motif, which isn't easy to identify, but we'll come back to it later. Below that, much more obvious, is Garuda. Below that again, a great bird with its beak being pushed open. This, of course, is the Bakashura story. And then there's a repeat. So below that, in a different colorway, I mean, high sophistication of technical production here. We have the Vastraharan scene again, and Kalyadaman, and so on. So there's a repeating sequence of scenes. And my view is that this doesn't provide a sort of narrative sequence. These depictions don't start at one end of a story and continue through to the end of it. There has been a suggestion that these textiles were produced as sort of didactic tools for describing the stories from the Bhagavata Purana. But my inclination is not to follow this explanation. There is no sort of obvious linkage. There are, though, more interesting items to suggest original usage, and one of them is this remarkable feature in the center of this slide here, the 11 lines of woven text. Each block of text repeats the same elements, and this is, we now know through the work of Homeran Borua, who used to be at the State Museum in Guwahati, but now lives in Paris. But it was he who noticed, or first translated these panels of text. These are repeated versions of a verse from a drama by Shankaradeva concerning the Kalyadaman story, and here it is. So this not only describes a scene from that drama, but it also gives at the top here in the first two lines the details about the raga in which it should be sung. So this gives a clue, I think, to the possible use of these strips of cloth. We'll perhaps speak more about this later, but it is a remarkable linkage between drama, Shankaradeva, and textile production. Now, looking at the other type of setup, we've seen scenes from the life of Krishna. Here we see avatars. These are not specifically Krishna, not specifically Krishna dominated. In fact, not, well, hardly at all, in fact, but they do seem to be rows of avatars of Vishnu, and some you can identify immediately. Here we have Narasimha, here we have Kurma, here we have Matsya. Here, unlike the rest of the panel, we have a Krishna story, Kalyadaman, in the center of the panel here. This we take to be Rama, a figure with a bow, and so on. Here, Varaha. Let's see some details. Here, quite clearly, Kurma at the top and Matsya below, and all captioned. You know, this is incredibly sophisticated work. I think the basis from which these depictions are being taken is from some listing of the avatars, and indeed in the Bhagavata Purana there are, of course, such listings. Finally, there are a small number of panels that are, well, I like to think of them as sort of second 11. They're not as grand as the other ones, and that may make them later. Not nearly so much silk has been used in their production. The imagery is all, as it were, stretched out. It's not nearly as dense, and it may be that here we have a type of textile that could be commissioned perhaps for half the price of one of the others, where you have a much denser, much more pulled together, a much more elaborate structure. Here is a detail of one of these. You'll see immediately here this great serpent figure in the center of the panel and cattle around. So I've identified this as the Akashura narrative from the Bhagavata Purana. That it may be true, that may be the case, though what this figure above is about, it's very difficult to ascertain. We don't know what that is. And there are a number of problems with some of these identifications that we still have to resolve. Here is another of these less elaborate, less densely woven versions, panels, and again we're going to look at one or two of the narratives shown here. This one I've assumed must be a version of Vastraharan. Here is a male figure, crowned, seated in a tree, with a female figure below. Surely that's Vastraharan. But what the presence of the elephant is, I don't know. Maybe there's no relevance to be attached to it. Maybe in Assam in the 16th and 17th centuries, all forests had lots of elephants in them. So, it may be unimportant, but I'm suspicious of using that as an answer, because everything in these textiles seems to have some purpose, even if it's not immediately obvious. One or two other queries that we have. This is a section from the listing of the avatars. You'll see Rama at the top and clearly a Varaha below. But this one in the center is a little uncertain. I think it's probably Vaman. There's a thread across the chest here. There seems to be some sort of garland being offered in some sort of religious ceremony, which could be Brahmanical, and therefore, it could be Vaman. But I'm not absolutely certain. And the inscription's not helpful, unfortunately. A further query is this group of figures. Elsewhere, we've seen both Garuda and we've seen Bakashura. This upper register, in which you see two depictions of Garuda, these are actually very close to how Garuda is shown today in Assamese Namgar. Very often they're placed right at one end of the Namgar, with a prayer hall facing in the distance the enshrined Bhagavata Purana. So this, I think, must be, well, I'm sure it's Garuda. The figure below, a bird figure, is it Bakashura again, or is it some other narrative that's being described here? And he has an open beak, but there's no figure pulling it open, and the only other element is a little smaller bird here on the back. So this is still uncertain as to identity. Now, finally, one more uncertain, not yet identified item is this feature, which we've seen previously, and I mentioned it briefly in passing. My colleagues and informants in Assam, to whom I'm hugely grateful for being able to understand so much of this textile, assured me that this was just a decorative item, a decorative element within the textile, and it's conceivable that that's true. But given that everything else is so narrative specific, I think that's unlikely. And I wonder whether this is not the story of the forest fire consumed by Krishna. He's not present, of course, but forest is suggested by flowering trees and this sort of swirling pinwheel could well be taken to be the consuming fire. But you know, we're still undecided about that. If anyone has any suggestions, I'd be grateful for them. Now, moving from uncertainties to more certain territory, one of the distinctive features of a number of these individual strips of woven cloth is the prominence of the Kaliyadaman story. And in fact, there are at least 3 different versions. I'm particularly fond of this one, and you may remember right at the beginning of my talk, I showed a excuse me, a close-up of the textile to demonstrate the foreground and the background that can be produced with the Lampas technique. Well, the detail is from this area here. Here we have 5-headed Kaliya, 4 heads facing downwards, sort of in defeat, I suppose, and 1 in white, no longer in yellow, acknowledging the figure of Krishna, who is dancing on the top of the head. So that's one version of Kaliyadaman. Here's another one that we find repeatedly. So it's Kaliya is single-headed, though maybe these features here are in some way a sort of suggestion of further heads. I don't know. Anyway, and here is Krishna quite clearly. And then there's this one, rather different sort of imagining of that narrative. So Kaliyadaman seems to have been important. I can only speculate as to why this is so. The presence also of a lot of Matsya and Kurma imagery is maybe connected, and I just sort of wonder very hesitantly, definitely hesitantly, whether you know, these fish, tortoise, river serpent all have some linkage and some sort of sympathy, as it were, for local Assamese in the 16th and 17th centuries, living in a highly riverine, river water dominated landscape. I'm going to say no more than that, but it's possible. Now, we haven't spoken at all about what these textiles woven in this incredibly sophisticated way were used for. If you visit a Namgar, an Assamese shrine to Krishna today, of course there's great variety, but in most of them, there is an enshrined copy of the Bhagavata Purana. There are some Namgar where you do have images, but the Namgar that purport to maintain the original teaching of Shankaradeva, in those Namgar, there are no images, and there is only the enshrined Bhagavata, because that was considered to be all you ever needed to know and to venerate. They are usually housed in these structures on stepped platforms, sinhasana, and down the front of them are these textile banners, and inside the Bhagavata Purana is wrapped in the end of this textile. So I think, and I'm not the first to say this, but I think it's quite likely that these strips of Lampas woven Krishna and Vishnu dominated imagery, these textiles were probably used to wrap individual texts, often the Bhagavata, of course, but also possibly other religious narratives. And of course, you will remember earlier on, we looked at that woven panel of 11 lines of script from the drama Kalidaman by Shankaradeva, and that strip not only has the woven fragment of text, but it also has Kalidaman imagery on it. I can't help feeling it that it's quite likely that that strip of cloth did not was not made to wrap the Bhagavata, but was made to wrap a copy of the actual drama itself by Shankaradeva. The items that show, the strips of cloth that show Vaishnava imagery, that show avatars, this is much more likely, I think, to have been used to wrap Bhagavata Purana texts. So this seems to be a good fit in terms of function, but and mostly the examples that have survived, now scattered all over the world, the examples that survive are all of about the same width, and so could well have been used to wrap manuscripts of the Sanchipat variety that you find in Assam, much larger, of course, than the palm leaf manuscripts found elsewhere in India. So let's now move on and think about how all those 12 individual strips of woven textile that have recently been on display in the British Museum and which have been there since 1905, let's think about what their history has been. So all we can say at present is they were woven in Assam. We think probably, from what little evidence there is in the texts, probably in Lower Assam, perhaps around Barpeta. Then what? Well, you may have noticed earlier that the entire 9-meter length of the British Museum textile has at the top 3 strips of Chinese damask, and above that 1 strip of brocade. And I think, oh, excuse me. And at the top, right at the top, yes, you can see there's a rope and metal rings. So at some point, the 3 strips of brocade, 3 strips of damask, and the single piece of brocade, and the hanging apparatus were added to the textile, and they were all stitched together. There's a further clue on the reverse. This is a seal, a Tibetan monastic seal. We can't read it today, but it's quite clear that that's what it is. We know enough about these seals to be able to recognize certain elements from it. And in the records at the British Museum, we don't know quite how this information arrived there, but in the BM records, it says that the textile was acquired We don't know how, and I'm a little anxious to ever find out how, but it was acquired at this monastery, which is Gobshi, which is just to the east of Gyantse in southern Tibet. Gobshi was also, yes, Gobshi was also interesting for not only having a temple, a monastery there, as you see here, but also because it was a great carpet producing center. And that is why the photograph we've just looked at, which was taken by this chap, why he was visiting there. This is Arthur Hopkinson, who was the British trade agent in southern Tibet, based at Gyantse in the late 1920s. These photographs are now in the BM collection, and I was honored to know his widow. I mean, it's extraordinary. He was there in the 1920s, and Eleanor Hopkinson and I met in the 1990s, I suppose. So there's a very long period of development here. But anyway, Eleanor Hopkinson gave the photographs that her husband had taken in the 1920s and early 1930s to the British Museum, where they're now online and can be viewed there. But of course, Arthur Hopkinson was based in Gyantse as the British trade agent because only a few years earlier, this man, Sir Francis Younghusband, had been rampaging around in southern Tibet. The Younghusband Expedition, which was sent from British India to Lhasa in 1903-04, was an attempt to open up trade between, or to open up a trade route through to China. It was, well, it had some very modest success in that, well, not in that direction, but it did mean that there was a trade agent based in Gyantse in the for the next several decades. The first or second of whom was Arthur Hopkinson, whose portrait we've just seen. On that expedition to Lhasa, 1903, 1904, this man, Percival Landon, was a member of that expedition. And as you can see from the title page of his book, he was the special correspondent on the expedition of the London Times. And it was he who gave the huge Assamese textile in its Tibetan form to the British Museum in 1905. So only a year after the end of the expedition, the textile was already in the BM. Now, what we don't know, sadly, or anyway, sadly, we don't know how Landon acquired the textile. We do know that when troops moved up from India through southern Tibet, certainly around Gyantse, we know that on the way up, there was looting. That's recorded. What we also know is that by the time they got to Lhasa, because of course, amazingly, a telegraph was operating then, so information could get back to London very quickly. Already by the time they got up to Lhasa, there'd been a very fierce reaction against that looting, and soldiers were much more constrained and made to be more orderly in both in Lhasa and then on the way back. Now, as I say, we don't know how or when Landon acquired this. I hesitate to. I mean, we can only speculate. He can either have stolen it, he could have bought it, it could have conceivably been given to him, we just don't know. And we don't know even that he acquired it in Tibet. We know that a lot of material came out of Tibet at the time of the Younghusband Expedition, and it may well have been that he acquired it in Calcutta. We just don't know, sadly. The only thing we do know is that it came from Gobshi. And we must assume that somehow, we don't know the details, it's very frustrating, but when those individual strips of Lampas woven silk textile entered Tibet at some unknown time, we don't know, and were acquired by monks at Gobshi, they stitched them together, added damask and brocade, and hung them in a room. I mean, it's quite well known in Tibet, of course, for textiles to be hung around a room to provide warmth. So we can only speculate about that, but that seems the likely usage. The fact that, of course, in a Buddhist monastery, you are displaying textiles covered in Vaishnava imagery, it doesn't seem to have been a problem. It was a beautiful thing to look at. The text was unintelligible. Why not use it? That's my sort of view about it. I don't think in any sense there was an understanding of what these things were. Why they left Assam is also not at all clear, but the British Museum example is not the only example where these Vaishnava textiles have turned up in Tibet. In fact, so far as I know, there is only one example anywhere in the world that doesn't have a Tibet ancestry. So at some point, there was a sort of mass exodus of Vrindavani Vastra textiles, woven silk, Vaishnava textiles out of Assam and into Tibet. Much of these elements of logistics are yet to be unscrambled. Landon also gave other Tibetan items to the British Museum, including this beer jug here. He was also, intriguingly, a good friend of Rudyard Kipling. And here I'm entering a zone of yet further speculation, but Landon died in 1927, and he had previously often visited Rudyard Kipling at his house in Sussex, and apparently used to take things from all over the world. He reported not only in Tibet and India, but also elsewhere in the world. And he took them to show Kipling. And after Landon died in 1927, Kipling wrote this poem, A Song in the Desert. And although it's slightly elusive, I think it's very poignant. Let me just read it to you. Remember, this is Kipling speaking about Landon. Gems and wrought gold, never sold, brought for me to behold them. Tales of far magic unrolled. Now, note that word, unrolled. Tales of far magic unrolled, to me only he told them, with the light, easy laugh of dismissal twixt story and story, as a man brushes sand from his hand, or the great dismiss glory. I can't help wondering whether Tales of Far Magic Unrolled is a reflection of Landon hurrying down to Sussex with his treasure recently acquired on his return from India to show Kipling. we can't know ever, but it's a very poignant and interesting comment by Kipling. Now, in the exhibition that the British Museum had recently, in which we showed the 9-meter plus single Vrindavani Vastra textile, we also showed one or two other examples of the way in which these textiles have survived. As I mentioned, all examples except one have come from Tibet or from the Himalayas. This is an example that has come from the Himalayas, from Bhutan, in fact, and it's the back of a huge tanka, a huge applique tanka, and what you see is fragments, tragic fragments, all cut up, all used topsy-turvy as backing for this tanka. This one is in the BM collection, another one is in the V&A, and I think others are known around the world where Assamese textiles have been cut up to be used to make backings for tankas. So there must have been a lot of this material around. Why it doesn't survive anywhere in Assam and only in Tibet must be, I suppose, because of the climate. You know, intense cold in Tibet ensures that organic material survives well. So this is a further type of survival of these textiles. And then here, this is the only example I know anywhere in the world of a Vrindavani Vastra textile surviving, which didn't come out of Tibet. This is a star item in the small municipal museum in Chepstow in South Wales, and it's what's sort of generically called a banyan. That is a excuse me, a sort of morning coat for a gentleman at home. Pretty swagger thing. The exterior, as you can see here, is made of fine Chinese damask. You would have cut you would have been immediately noticeable wearing this. But the remarkable thing for us is this: when you open it, it's lined with Assamese textile, Assamese Vaishnava textile, and of course, very strikingly, the color is fantastically clear still. It's very bright, and compared to the great big one at the BM, you know, this one is infinitely better and more striking. But it's been cut up, of course, and used again in a, I mean, rather like the backing of the tanka, it's been used to for a completely different purpose. And you know, one can only imagine what the presumably Englishman who had this made in India thought about it. I mean, he almost certainly wouldn't have understood the Vaishnava imagery, but it's pretty remarkable. And I think the contrast between, you know, the cool sophistication of the Chinese damask here with its glorious floral imagery, and then this, the lining, which is just so colorful and dramatic and impressive. You can imagine swirling around in this and making a huge impression, I think. So this uses very similar but not identical imagery to the one at the BM, or to various strips at the BM, bearing in mind that, you know, several of those 12 different strips may be of different date. But here in the center, you can quite clearly see the Kalia story, and then above it, Ugra Narasimha, but others are not so easy to identify. Here's a figure with a bow, which we presume is Rama. Here's a close-up of the Kalia figure, and you'll see above the head 4 sort of prongs, antennae. I take these to be sort of shorthand for the other four heads. The Narasimha is much more dramatically shown than is the than in the British Museum example. The entrails of the hapless Hiranyakashipu are very clearly indicated, and this is amazingly the whole textile turned inside out. These photographs were all taken at the time of its conservation, prior to it being exhibited at the British Museum. So it's very rare that we will ever be able to see it in this state again, because of the creasing of the outer garment. But it is a very, very impressive and remarkable survival. But like so many of these other examples, we have little information about how it came to be where it is today. The museum at Chepstow acquired a local collection in the 1960s, and this was in it. Beyond that, there's the trail goes cold. So it's really very frustrating. But I've written in the wee book I wrote about that came out at the time of the exhibition, that I assumed that this must have been some wealthy, this must have belonged to some wealthy English merchant, perhaps, who had it made up in Calcutta, and then brought brought back to the UK, and its history after that is unknown. If you're ever in that corner of South Wales, do go have a look at it. It's a very, very remarkable survival. Now, sorry. And included in it are familiar items that we've seen before, including text. This is that same verse from the Kalidaman drama by Shankaradeva that we saw earlier on. So there are obviously close links with the items that are now in the British Museum. Here, clearly also Parashuram, Matsya, yes, repeating. So Parashuram, Matsya, and so on. Now, I'm coming towards the end of what I want to say, but before that, I just want to show you this painting. It's a Tibetan painting, probably early 13th century, but its interest to us today, this evening, is that when it entered the British Museum in the 1950s, 1950 itself, it came with the information that it was acquired in Tibet at the time of the Younghusband Expedition. Now, some years ago, when in your museum, I was looking at your spectacular Tibetan displays, I noticed another painting which seemed to be from this same series. And so I wondered whether it came from the same source. I've no idea, I've not investigated further, but it would be fascinating to know whether certain Younghusband, and it would not be surprising either, whether certain Younghusband items came to the CSMVS in the years after the expedition, and items were divided. So I think there are two paintings in this series in the CSMVS. We have two, and then there are also others in a collection that what was previously a private collection, the Benkamp collection in Los Angeles. I think this is now in the Cincinnati Art Museum. So widely spread, but very intriguing, and of course very dramatic and impressive examples of early Tibetan painting based clearly on Eastern Indian prototypes, and of course with Lancha text around the outsides. So that's a little bombouche, a little extra as I draw to a close. But I thought it would just be interesting to finish by thinking about further subjects that we could explore in the future. I mean, one, trace further examples of items from the Younghusband Expedition, and perhaps unite them online. That would be rather interesting, so that things are no longer seen as singletons, but as a group. And then secondly, I've listed here to understand better the link between the textile panels in the Vrindavani Vastra and the Bhagavata Purana. Of course, we blithely say that the Bhagavata is the source for all this imagery, but I think it's most likely that there are many intermediary texts between, and it would be fascinating to tease these out. And then also to better understand the still significant link between Krishna devotion and textile production in Assam. And as you will have seen from what I've spoken about during this short presentation, there are many uncertainties about these wonderful textiles. And I suspect that I will go on worrying about, and perhaps even teasing out a few of the answers over the remaining years of my retirement. I hope often spending time in your wonderful museum as well. So thank you very much for your attention this evening. Thank you.